All right, let's talk about the advanced settings for FlashPrint. When you click Print, you'll have access to all of the print settings, and I'm going to go over the ones that are most applicable for you. Now again, you should be using one of these profiles most of the time. If your prints are failing, it's probably because the printer extruder isn't calibrated correctly, or the bed isn't level, or some other hardware issue. So solve those first before tinkering with any of the settings. These profiles are created after 300 printing hours of experience. I've set up 4 of the FlashForge finders, and running these settings creates a perfect first print each time as long as the printer is set up correctly. So you shouldn't need to tinker with these too much. However, I think it's helpful for you to understand what these settings mean in case you do decide to tinker with them to fine-tune your printing experience and also for your own professional development. So let's dive in. We're going to go over all of the general settings. For all of these settings, you can hover over the field for a quick tooltip on what the setting does, but I'm going to explain why I've set some of these the way I have. The layer height is just how thick each layer is. You can make this really, really small for super fine detail prints, or you can make it really big for thick, coarse prints. 0.2 millimeters is generally a good place to start. It's fine enough that it produces some detail, but it won't take too long, because the thinner the layers are, the longer the print will take. So the first layer height is the height of your first layer. This is usually thicker than all the other layers, because if the print bed is slightly uneven, having a thick first layer helps mitigate that. The extruder temperature is how hot the extruder gets. 200 is just right for PLA. However, if you're in an exceptionally hot environment, you may want to reduce this just a little bit. So the printing speed and the travel speed. The print speed is how fast the filament actually comes out of the extruder. The travel speed is how quickly the extruder moves around the print bed. The faster these are, the sloppier the print is going to be. These are set to pretty fast, so if you'd like, you can lower them a little bit if you have smaller classes. But generally speaking, if you're printing out a lot of camper projects, it's okay to keep the speeds up pretty high. Retraction is how much the filament is pulled back up into the extruder when it's moving around. If this were set to 0 and there were no retraction, little bits of melted filament would stay on the end of the extruder and would get dragged from point to point, which creates these really messy looking web-like strings. These retraction settings are going to prevent that from happening. Okay, let's go to perimeter. I'm just going to talk about the thickness and speed. These settings never need to change. So shell count is just how many solid layers are on the outside of the print. The more there are, the thicker the outside of the print is going to be. 2 is fine. The speed settings in this section only pertain to the perimeter. So the exterior speed is how fast these outer walls are made. This is variable because sometimes it doesn't matter if the inside is messy as long as the outside looks okay, so you can slow it down a little bit. Visible interior speed is the speed that interior perimeters will print at. So if you imagine like a donut, the outside of the donut is the exterior, the inside, the inner ring is the interior. Okay, let's look at infill. And we're just going to talk about general and speed. So general, the top and bottom solid layers. These are the number of layers that are completely solid in each print. If you have just one, sometimes it's a little thin and raggedy and you can see through it. So 3 is usually a good place to be. The fill density is how much infill is actually inside the model. At 15%, it's going to look pretty loose. And if you were to put this all the way up to 100%, that would be a completely solid infill. This number has a huge effect on how long the prints take, so I strongly advise keeping it as low as possible. 15% is usually good for most models. You can have this higher if there's a part that needs to be durable for one reason or another, like if a camper is making a catapult and the parts need to hold some kind of load. Or you can make it at 0 if the camper is making a cup or any sort of thin-walled vessel. Keep the fill pattern as hexagon, that's the strongest and most efficient. Overlap perimeter, this determines how much the infill overlaps with the other parts of the print. And finally, keep vase mode off unless a camper is actually printing a vase. What this does is it prevents the extruder from ever leaving the model and it just circles around and around and around like in a continuous spiral. This will also not create any infill. And finally, the speed. Solid speed is how quickly the top and bottom layers print, and sparse speed is how quickly the infill prints. Solid speed is a little bit lower because the top and bottom layers usually need to look a little bit nicer, since those are very visible. Okay, let's go to supports. The supports that FlashPrint automatically generates are tree-like because they spread in a branch-like way. Again, the speed is just the relative speed that the supports print at compared to the base speed. The space to the model is how far away the supports are from the model. The farther away the supports are, the easier it is to detach them from the model, but it might also make them break away prematurely. Conversely, the closer the supports are to the model, the more likely they are to stay connected, but also be harder to remove. Shell count is how thick the supports are, and you pretty much always want this option turned to yes. This will prevent the extruder from colliding with supports and knocking them over. Okay, let's go to the raft. Yes, you always want a raft enabled. The margin is how far away the raft will build out from the model's base. So in this case, the raft will be 3 millimeters wider than the base of the model. Space to model is the distance between the raft and the model. The bigger this is, the easier it is to remove the two apart, and the smaller this is, the more likely it is to stay connected during the printing. I've learned that 0.25 millimeters strikes a good balance. Okay, the bottom layer. This is the very first layer of all of your prints, so these settings are very important. I strongly recommend not changing any of these. Okay, we know what layer height is. The path width is how wide the extruded filament will be for the raft. The wider this is, the more likely the raft is going to adhere to the print bed. So I've set it pretty wide at 3 millimeters. It can go wider, but I don't think you need it. Fill density. In this case, it just means how dense is this first layer going to be. 95% is as dense as it goes. And this is what you want, because the greater fill density there is, the more stable the raft is going to be. However, it will take longer to print, but it's well worth it. So the speed is exactly what it sounds like, but you'll notice that it is very, very slow. And this is because the raft is an incredibly thick layer of filament. It's a whole 0.2 millimeters tall and 3 millimeters wide. There's a lot of filament coming out of the extruder. If this speed is increased, the extruder actually can't melt the filament fast enough, and it won't be able to extrude it out. So this has to stay at 5 millimeters per second. And finally, the middle layers and top layers. These are additional raft layers that put some space between the bottom layer and the print. So remember, the goal of the bottom layer is to adhere to the print bed. The middle and top layers, the goal is to create a medium between this bottom layer and the model. If the model printed directly on the bottom layer, it would look kind of messy, so these layers create a nice smooth intermedium. Consequently, since these layers are not adhering to the print bed, you'll notice that it speeds up gradually. And lastly, we have additions. Pre-extrusion is a little bit of filament that is extruded before the print actually begins. You'll always want this turned on. It's sort of like clearing out the nozzle before the real printing begins. And these settings determine just how much of that filament is being extruded. Keep the speed really low to avoid jams. You'll pretty much never need a wall. This is just for printers with dual extrusion. And the brim. A brim is kind of like a raft, except it's designed to help prevent warping. I haven't found this to be particularly useful for printing in PLA filament for this particular model of printer, but if you are a 3D printing expert, you can choose to turn on the brim and fiddle with those settings. The last settings, cooling, advanced, and others, you don't need to use any of those settings. All right, those are all the 3D printing settings that you need to know about. As you become a 3D expert, and if you feel courageous enough to create your own custom crafted profiles, you can click Save as New and create my best profile. And then from here, you can customize your own settings. Thanks for watching, and happy 3D printing!